Space exploration looks glamorous from Earth. Breathtaking views, zero gravity, heroic scientists doing important work for all of humanity. What NASA doesn't show you is what it smells like in there, what happens to your body after 6 months, or why 70% of astronauts come home with permanently damaged eyes. The truth about life 250 miles above Earth is far more disgusting and far more alarming than you've been told. The International Space Station. Humanity's greatest engineering achievement and, as it turns out, its most unsanitary long-term habitat. Continuously inhabited since November 2000, 25 years of accumulated biological reality that NASA's public relations machine carefully keeps out of sight. Today we are going to explore 3 uncomfortable truths about what it actually means to live in space. First, the filth that astronauts live in every single day, from the toilet to the food to the smell that never goes away. Second, what the space environment systematically does to the human body, and the numbers are genuinely alarming. Third, what happens to the station itself and the human mind after months of living inside a metal can that is slowly falling apart. Everything you think you know about living in space is wrong. Let's start with something basic. Going to the bathroom. On Earth, gravity handles most of the unpleasant work of being a biological organism. Sweat falls away from your skin, waste drops, odors disperse, water drains. In space, none of that happens. Gravity does nothing because there is no gravity, and the consequences of that single fact are more disgusting than most people ever consider. Let's start with the toilet. There is no running water on the International Space Station, no plumbing in any conventional sense. Fans and suction do the job that gravity normally handles automatically. Astronauts use small funnels and hoses for urination and a compact seat with foot restraints and handholds for defecation. The toilet automatically starts suction when the lid is lifted, to control both the smell and any free-floating droplets before they become everyone's problem. Solid waste goes into perforated plastic bags inside a sealed canister. Once that canister is full, it gets packed into a cargo ship. And then it waits, for weeks sometimes. Living on board the station while that cargo ship is being loaded means the crew is, quite literally, living next to containers of their own waste for the duration. When the cargo ship finally departs, it burns up in the atmosphere on re-entry, taking the waste with it. But waste disposal is only part of the story. Let's talk about what happens to the urine. NASA's Environmental Control and Life Support System, ECLSS, now recovers approximately 98% of all water aboard the station. It distills water out of urine, out of sweat, out of exhaled breath, out of the humidity in the cabin air. It then runs that water through filters until it is technically drinkable again. NASA's own engineers have a saying about this system: yesterday's coffee becomes tomorrow's coffee. The system even includes a brine processor that squeezes the last remaining moisture out of urine concentrate. The exhaust outlet for that brine processor, the point where the last residue gets vented, was described by European Space Agency astronaut Samantha Cristoforetti as the single worst-smelling spot on the entire station, not the toilet area. The brine exhaust. You are drinking recycled urine every day for 6 months. And the worst-smelling location on the station is not the bathroom, it is the machine that processes the urine into your drinking water. Now imagine trying to stay clean in this environment. There are no showers on the International Space Station, none. Astronauts use rinseless wipes. They squeeze water from sealed drink bags onto their skin and hair, carefully controlling every floating droplet because water in zero gravity does not drain away, it floats until it hits something, and that something is usually a surface, a piece of equipment, or another crew member. There is no washing machine either. Clothes get worn until they are too soiled to tolerate, then they are discarded. loaded onto a cargo ship, and incinerated on re-entry along with the waste canisters. The Canadian Space Agency estimates that 4 astronauts generate approximately 2,500 kilograms of trash per year, roughly 2 large garbage bins every single week. Much of it worn clothing, hygiene items, and food packaging. Each crew member has a limited personal toiletry kit and a small set of towels for their entire 6-month mission. Feeling clean becomes, over time, more of a psychological aspiration than a physical reality. Brushing teeth requires catching floating water on the bristles of a toothbrush, brushing carefully to prevent foam from escaping into the cabin, and then either swallowing specially formulated edible toothpaste or spitting into a towel and stowing that towel in the trash, which, as we've established, stays on board for weeks before disposal. Now let's talk about the smell. Despite aggressive filtration systems running continuously, the International Space Station has a persistent, distinctive odor that newcomers take days to adjust to. Astronaut Scott Kelly, who spent nearly a year on the station, compared the smell to a room in the Harris County Jail, a mix of antiseptic, garbage, and body odor that permeates certain modules. British astronaut Tim Peake described it as a barbecue gone wrong. Christopher Reddy refers simply to a very peculiar odor, with the trash storage areas, the waste canisters, and that urine brine exhaust as the acknowledged worst hotspots. NASA once hired a biochemist named Steve Pierce specifically to recreate the smell of space station for training purposes. Pierce ended up with a blend he described as hot metal, burnt meat, and spent gunpowder layered over a persistent metallic tang. That is the smell of a place humans have been continuously living in for 25 years. There is no gravity to disperse odors. Sweat does not evaporate naturally. It clings to skin until wiped away with a towel. Used workout clothes get worn for multiple days before disposal. Astronaut Thomas Pesquet has described how the weekly cleaning day includes scrubbing Node 3, which houses the toilet and the exercise equipment, and Node 1, where the galley is. These modules collect sweat, food residue, and biological buildup, and by the end of every week they are the 2 worst-smelling locations on the station. Then there is the food. Eating in space is compromised in ways that most people never consider. Microgravity causes body fluids to shift permanently upward toward the head. The result is a chronic stuffy nose sensation that blunts the sense of smell. And without smell, taste becomes flat and muted. Everything tastes blander. Crew members consistently report gravitating toward spicier, more intensely flavored foods because subtle flavors simply disappear. Hot sauces, mustard, curries, anything that delivers impact through heat or sharpness rather than nuance. Meals themselves come in sealed pouches. Astronauts inject hot or cold water to rehydrate dehydrated food, knead the pouch while the food absorbs it, then cut it open and eat directly from the bag with a spoon, often velcroing the pouch to a wall so it doesn't drift away mid-meal. Liquids come through straws with one-way valves. A stray droplet of sauce can float into a fan or someone's eye. Here is the serious consequence that goes beyond inconvenience. When food becomes consistently unappealing, astronauts undereat. And undereating in an environment that is already systematically breaking down your body accelerates that breakdown dramatically. Which brings us to what space actually does to human physiology. Let's start with bones. Without gravity constantly pushing against them, weight-bearing bones stop maintaining themselves. The spine and hips, the bones that carry your body weight on Earth, begin losing density at a rate of 1 to 1.5% per month. By the standards of medicine on Earth, that rate is classified as severe osteoporosis. Canada's T-Bone study tracked astronauts through long-duration missions and compared their bone scans before and after. The conclusion: a 6-month stay on the International Space Station produces bone loss equivalent to nearly 20 years of normal age-related decline. 20 years in 6 months, and the recovery process is incomplete. Some of the structural changes to bone appear to be permanent even after 9 months of intensive rehabilitation back on Earth. 9 months of recovery, and astronauts still have not fully reclaimed what 6 months in space took from them. But bones are just the beginning. Let's talk about muscle. Astronauts exercise 2 hours every single day on the station. 2 full hours every day with specialized resistance equipment and carefully designed exercise protocols developed by NASA specifically to fight what microgravity does to the human body. And they still lose significant muscle mass. A detailed study of International Space Station crew members documented a 13% decrease in calf muscle volume over 6 months despite that daily exercise regimen. The soleus muscle, which is the primary muscle responsible for keeping you upright and balanced while standing and walking, shrank 15%. The gastrocnemius, the large muscle in the back of the lower leg, lost around 10%. Peak power output fell by 32%. Astronauts returned to Earth unable to walk without assistance. They have elevated risk of falls and fractures for weeks after landing. 2 hours of daily exercise is not enough to fight what the complete absence of gravitational loading does to human musculature. But neither of those, not the bones, not the muscles, is the most disturbing finding from long-duration spaceflight. That distinction belongs to what is happening to the eyes. Microgravity shifts body fluids permanently toward the head throughout a mission. This creates chronic, mildly elevated pressure in the skull, and that pressure has a consequence that researchers did not fully anticipate. It flattens the back of the eyeball, swells the optic disc, and changes the structure of the eye in ways that can permanently degrade vision. The condition is called spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome, SANS. NASA considers it one of the top human spaceflight risks for future deep space missions. And here is the number that should stop you. Approximately 70% of International Space Station astronauts show clinical signs of SANS. Flattened eyeballs, swollen optic discs, permanent vision changes. Some astronauts return from the ISS farsighted who were not farsighted when they left. The long-term neurological implications are not yet fully understood. Similar chronic intracranial pressure conditions on Earth are linked not only to vision loss but to cognitive impairment. NASA researchers are actively studying whether repeated long-duration missions contribute to lasting neurological changes. There is currently no confirmed countermeasure. Then there is radiation. The International Space Station orbits within the partial protection of Earth's magnetic field, which provides meaningful shielding compared to deep space. But astronauts still absorb between 12 and 28 times the daily radiation dose of a person on the ground. There is a region called the South Atlantic Anomaly, an area where charged particles from space dip unusually close to Earth. Every time the ISS passes through this region, radiation levels spike to up to 1,000 times normal background levels. The station passes through it regularly. Operational procedures and shielding limit crew exposure, but the spike is real. Long-term consequences of this chronic radiation exposure include elevated lifetime cancer risk, cataracts, and potential cardiovascular and neurological impacts. 1 year on the International Space Station can consume a significant fraction of an astronaut's total career radiation exposure quota. The limit NASA sets before cumulative risk becomes too high to justify continued flight assignments. And all of this, the bone loss, the muscle atrophy, the eye damage, the radiation, is happening to people who are already living in the conditions described in the previous chapter. The filth is not separate from the physical deterioration. They compound each other. Undereating because food tastes flat accelerates the muscle and bone loss. Poor sleep, which we will get to in a moment, impairs the body's ability to repair cellular radiation damage. The station is not just an unpleasant place to live, it is an environment that degrades the human body on multiple fronts simultaneously. The first module of the International Space Station was launched in November 1998. Core structural elements are now more than 25 years old. They were designed for a 30-year operational lifespan, and that limit is approaching. The consequences of that age are not hypothetical. The Russian segment has experienced recurring air leaks that have been patched repeatedly with tape and epoxy. In August 2018, flight controllers detected a slow pressure loss that was eventually traced to a 2-millimeter drill hole in the orbital module of a docked Soyuz spacecraft. Cosmonauts patched it from inside. The hole had either been drilled during manufacturing or in orbit, and the investigation never fully resolved which. A 2-millimeter hole in a metal wall between 6 human beings and the vacuum of space, patched with tape and epoxy. In June 2014, the crew reported visible smoke coming from a vent in the Russian Zvezda service module, their primary living area. Controllers isolated the ventilation system and traced the problem to an overheated heater in a water recycling unit. For several minutes, there was visible smoke in the room where the crew eats and sleeps. NASA later confirmed no lasting danger, but that is a cold comfort for the crew members who watched smoke appear in their living space. In January 2015, ammonia leak alarms triggered emergency procedures that sent the entire crew to shelter in the Russian segment for approximately 11 hours while the US segment was sealed off and air samples were collected. It turned out to be a false alarm, a computer relay glitch, but for 11 hours the crew did not know that. They sheltered in a different section of the station waiting to find out whether the air in their home had become poisonous. Beyond structural failures, the station has a biological contamination problem. Culture studies and genetic analysis of ISS surfaces and dust have found diverse populations of bacteria and fungi throughout the station. Staphylococcus from human skin, Malassezia yeast, Aspergillus flavus and Aspergillus niger, opportunistic molds, Penicillium species capable of producing toxins. Some of these organisms have been found to be resistant to multiple antibiotics, which researchers believe may be a consequence of the station's closed, low-gravity environment. Quantitative sampling found cultivable bacterial loads ranging from modest levels to over 2.5 million colony-forming units per square meter at some sites. Endotoxin, a component of gram-negative bacterial cell walls, was detected on 24 of 42 tested surfaces, including sleeping areas, dining zones, and exercise equipment. NASA currently plans to retire and deorbit the International Space Station around 2030 or 2031. Partly because it has achieved everything it was built to do, and partly because maintaining an aging structure of this complexity safely becomes increasingly demanding and expensive with every passing year. Now let's talk about what this environment does to the human mind. Each astronaut's private space on the station is a sleeping pod roughly the size of a phone booth. Inside, a sleeping bag strapped to the wall. That is it. That is the entirety of private space for 6 months. Outside the pod, everything is shared. The galley, the toilet, the exercise equipment, the research modules, with up to 5 other people under constant psychological pressure from different cultures, in a space the pressurized volume of which is roughly comparable to a large house. The station is never quiet. Fans, pumps, and life support systems run continuously, producing constant background noise. NASA acoustic standards allow noise during sleep periods up to a level comparable to a loud office or a busy home environment. Astronauts routinely wear earplugs to sleep. This is not an occasional disruption, it is 6 months of sleeping in a loud room. Carbon dioxide levels aboard the station are consistently far higher than on Earth. Research conducted on ISS data found that every 1 millimeter of mercury increase in CO2 concentration doubled the reported odds of astronauts experiencing headaches. At the levels that are normal aboard the station, roughly 10 times what exists at sea level on Earth. Crew members experience more headaches, more sleep disruption, and more irritability than they would in any earthbound environment. Sleeping with a headache becomes, for many astronauts, a routine occupational fact. The station orbits Earth every 90 minutes. Crew members experience 16 sunrises and 16 sunsets every 24 hours. Circadian rhythm, the internal biological clock that governs sleep and wakefulness, depends on light cues. The ISS destroys those cues completely. Genuine restful sleep becomes a memory that gets harder to access the longer the mission runs. Cosmonaut Valentin Lebedev spent 211 days in orbit on an earlier Soviet space station. By the end of his mission, he had become persistently irritable and depressed. He stopped looking out the window at Earth. Think about what that means. A human being with one of the most extraordinary views in the history of our species, the entire planet turning below him, who could no longer bring himself to look at it. That is not exhaustion. That is a mind that has been ground down. NASA's Human Research Program identifies behavioral health as a top mission failure risk for long-duration spaceflight. More dangerous, they note, than most hardware failures, because a hardware failure might disable one system. A crew member in psychological crisis can disable everything. Let's come back to the smell. We talked about it in the first chapter, but it belongs here too, because by month 6 it is not merely unpleasant, it has become psychologically inescapable. The International Space Station is 109 meters end to end. The pressurized habitable volume is roughly the size of a large house. It is shared with 5 other human beings and all of their biological processes, continuously for 6 months. There is nowhere to go. There is no outside. There is no fresh air. There is no relief. The filtration systems improve the air quality. They do not solve the fundamental problem. And here is the detail that Cristoforetti and others have noted. Eventually, astronauts stop noticing the smell. They become acclimatized to it. Their brains adapt to the persistent stench as normal. That psychological adaptation to an environment that would be considered uninhabitable by any earthbound standard may be the single most quietly disturbing aspect of long-duration spaceflight. The International Space Station is being retired. Around 2030 or 2031, it will be guided out of orbit and burn up on re-entry. The most expensive object humanity has ever built, deliberately destroyed, partly because it accomplished everything it was designed to accomplish, partly because keeping a 25-year-old structure in low Earth orbit safely becomes harder and more costly every year it continues to operate. Everything you heard in this video, the recycled urine, the crumbling bones, the floating mold, the 70% of astronauts with permanent eye damage, the cosmonaut who stopped looking out the window. That is a 6-month mission, 400 kilometers from home, with a lifeboat always docked at the door and a rescue flight reachable within hours. A Mars mission is 3 years, outside Earth's magnetic field for the entire duration. No lifeboat, no rescue, and we have not solved a single one of these problems yet. The next time you see those beautiful photographs of astronauts floating gracefully through gleaming ISS corridors, you know what you're not seeing. The smell, the bone loss accumulating every day, the eyes slowly changing under fluid pressure, the cosmonaut lying in a sleeping bag in a loud metal room, not looking out the window. Space exploration is genuinely one of humanity's greatest endeavors. But the reality of living in space is far more brutal, far more biological, and far more human than the promotional images suggest. The universe is not designed for us, and every long-duration mission proves that in the most visceral ways possible.